Hello, brothers and sisters. Raven here, and as has been happening, I am continuing through building Christian character. And I only go a few pages. I couldn't get very far without feeling like I need to come out and say it. After this, I'm going to try to hold back. I'm going to try to wait until I've gotten through a better chunk of this. But right now, I feel I need to give a better warning and a better signal of why to be careful with this book. It is extremely clever, as I pointed out before, but even further. This is how they indoctrinate. Do not, I repeat, do not read this first. From what I'm seeing, what it says in the intro, what it says in the synopsis, this should be more about applying what you believe, applying their teachings. If you start with this, which from what Zach said and what I've heard, this they treat more as the starting point. You do that, you're doing it backwards. You need to read the basis for this first. If you don't know what they're basing this on, you don't fully understand what's going on. And that's what they want. So do not read this first. Warn anybody you know who's trying to understand Homestead, who's trying to look into them, do not read this book first. Go into some of their other books. Maybe go into that 6-part series that they talk about within their Q&A and in their beliefs page on their website. Maybe go into those books. Though I still wouldn't suggest starting where they say to start. I'd say go to something else. Go to something like Saving Faith, or go into Is the Church Christ on Earth? Go to those. Go to the ones that really get into it, really state it, and don't babble indirectly. Just give it to you. Let you see it if you're really going to look for it, what they teach. And let me show you why. On page 2, Blair Adams, for the first time, does what he should do. He doesn't just quote scripture. He quotes a decent part of it. He doesn't pick out pieces, as he usually does when he quotes it. Here he gives a little bit of a better picture. It's a concept that doesn't take a whole lot. But let me read for you first what he uses. Within the book, he doesn't clarify what version. Aside from one word, this does seem to be the version he uses, and that's the NIV. And that one word isn't anything big, so I'm not concerned with that. So let me show you the verse, and then let me show you what he does with it. So this is Mark 12, 29 to 31. The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. This is where he answers that question. What's the most important commandment? And there they are. He gives 2. Love Lord your God. Love your neighbor. Those are the commandments. That you need to love the Lord. You need to love your neighbor. Remember that is the teaching. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's what you're commanded to do. Remember those 2 statements. Once again, love the Lord your God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, let's see what he says. Hidden in these scriptures lies the message upon which everything in God's kingdom rests. So the very foundation of this kingdom of the Lord is hidden in his word. It's hidden. Thus, Blair needs to write this book to reveal it. Remember what Zach said about it. Jesus himself declared that the first and greatest commandment is the one that begins with the revelation of God as one. This greatest of all commandments begins with the word hear. Now watch what he does here. This is so twisted. So we must first open our ears, come under the hearing of, then in parentheses, the literal meaning of the New Testament Greek word, I don't know how to say it, which we translate as obey. Now, stop for a second. Why does he need to clarify that? It's already said this is a commandment. It says it's the greatest. If it's a commandment, you're supposed to obey it. So why do you need to clarify that? You don't. He's just trying to show off what he knows. He's trying to make himself sound like he's well-versed in this. That's what this book is. This revelation of divine wholeness, of God's absolute integrity, his oneness. Obedience to this commandment ensures that our love for God, and therefore for others, will conform to the image of the living word coming from God's Spirit, the words that constantly express and reveals God. Form as we come under the hearing of that Spirit-revealed word. In case you didn't realize, this was supposed to be about what is the first and greatest commandment. Where does it mention the commandment? It's quite a ways in passing. His focus is not on the commandment in this. It doesn't come out until he says this. Obedience to this commandment ensures that our love for God, and therefore for others, will conform to the image of the living word. That is false. The commandment is having a love for God and for others. It's not doing anything to clarify how this obedience works. It's just saying that's what you need to obey. He wants to take the focus off of that commandment so the focus isn't on your love for God and others. It's more for your love for this commandment that he's going to push, this obedience that he's trying to cause. That's where his focus is. Know what it's set up at the top. First and greatest commandment is the one that begins with the revelation of God as one. And note, even with the way he quotes it, one, when it's stated that way in the verse, it is not capitalized. He does that. Why? Because of oneness. Once again, it's that pointing away from the Trinity without flat out stating it. That's why you shouldn't read this book first. That's why you need to know what they teach before you go into this kind of book. This is just indirect brainwashing. That's all this is. And know what it said. After finally bringing up what this really is about, loving God and loving others, it says this. Obedience, ... will conform to the image of the living word coming from God's Spirit. The words that constantly express and reveals God. Inform as we come under the hearing of that Spirit-revealed word. Spirit-revealed word. Remember what he said at the start of this? About how hidden this is? He's revealing it. He's making it look as though these commandments are all about following him, following his teachings, obeying this word he's revealing to you. Such clever and sly brainwashing in this. I mentioned it in the book. I don't recall if I've ever mentioned this to you in videos here on the channel, but one thing that this reminds me of, as I've said, I'm reading this because of how Zach Herbert praised it. I remember everybody was just crazy about Zach's teaching. I personally was concerned. I was worried. Tried warning a couple people. Seeing what everybody else said in response, I tried to back off, but I couldn't stand listening to it. I usually would just sort of sit outside of the room whenever he taught and just kind of try to let it go. Wish I hadn't just let it go, but that's what I tried to do. I tried to be patient and just try not to worry too much, and as at the time I thought, not gossip. Since I've learned what that means, and it wasn't that. But what I heard from people, what multiple people have said to some extent in some way, is how at the time, or maybe still do, the reason they listened to him was not because of how great, helpful, profound what he taught was in understanding Scripture. No, the reason they did was because of how great of a voice he had, how great a way of stating it he had. They just loved his way of speaking, just as I can see how people would love this way of writing. In this book in particular, some of the others it's much more ridiculous, but here I can understand a little bit more of how people might enjoy it, be drawn in by the way of writing. It's the same thing. A lot of people who went because of the manner of speaking didn't remember what was said, couldn't tell you exactly what they learned from it, because it wasn't really teaching. As I've said in the book, for Zach, it was more pushing guilt on you. Here, it's more of forcing an admiration of what is being taught to you. This is why this is the kind of book I can see them pointing toward. Like Zach said, everybody was telling him, have you read this? Have you read this? I can understand why they do that. Because like I'm saying, this is very slowly, like that frog in boiling water, pointing you in the direction they want you to go without saying it. They want to get you in that place where you fully trust them before they'll come out and show you what they really believe. However, here, if you're willing to stop, you're willing to look at it, you can find it. But it's very difficult unless you know what they teach already. So once again, do not read this book first. Do not even read his other books first. Read the Bible first. Make sure you know what it says. Then start reading what he's writing and make sure what he's saying does follow what Scripture says. If you're really going to follow it reasonably, if you're really going to put thought into it, I think you'll see a lot of what I see, maybe a little differently, but I think you'll see it if you're willing to reason through it. So to put this plain and simple, what he's teaching here and why this is so backwards, why this should not be first, is because what he's doing here is he's using these two commandments that Jesus said were greatest, but not to push these commandments, to try and twist them in a way where the biggest commandment is to follow what he's teaching you here. To follow him. The body is Christ, according to them. Blair's the leader. Or, some of you don't like to accept that. Whoever's writing this is leading. Thus, they're treating themselves as the head of Christ. God bless.